Inflation has been a hot topic in the news over the last year. One question is, how big of an impact will it have on your retirement? We're going to talk about reasons why it might have a big impact and why it might not have nearly as big of an impact as you think in your retirement on today's episode of Friends Talk Financial Planning. Hi, I'm John Scherer, and I run a fee-only financial planning practice in Middleton, Wisconsin.
And I'm Bridget Sullivan, Mermel, and I've got a fee-only financial planning practice in Chicago, Illinois. Before we talk inflation, we just want to remind people to please subscribe. It helps us grow our YouTube channel and help more people find us and helps our influence on YouTube. So, John, let's talk inflation. How do you approach this with clients?
Yeah, it was really interesting, Bridget. So Bridget and I had a discussion with a couple of peers recently, talk about Friends Talk Financial Planning, right? Getting in and just talking about one of our colleagues was using some new software and how to think about the inflation and how this particular software used that. And so we had a great discussion about what does that mean in retirement? And so there's a couple of schools of thought. One is that inflation does not have nearly as large of an impact on retirees as it does on other people due to various factors, including things like housing is not as big of an issue for retirees. And then the other school of thought is like, listen, things go up over time and we need to factor that in. And I'll tell you, so to answer your question, Bridget, how I think about that is I do think that inflation, that things are going to cost more in general in 20 years for our clients than they do today. It's based on history and there's no guarantees on those things. But so I do include inflation as I think about our future dollars. But then on the flip side, I also, when we're using our investment returns, I use historical inflation returns and I use historical average investment returns. And as I think about it, interesting having this discussion that probably neither one of those two are the right thing. Inflation's not going to be exactly what it was. Inflation's averaged something around 3 or 4%, but golly, if you retired in the 1960s, you had a lot higher inflation from 1965 to 1985. People still remember having double-digit mortgage rates, a high double-digit. And if you retired in, 1995 until 2015, you had a lot lower inflation. So the average might be 3 or 4%, but shoot, you had a lot lower inflation on that. Just like the average returns don't necessarily mean anything for individuals in our experiences, but it does give us some framework to think about. So that's how I look at it with folks, is just sort of projecting out those numbers. And I will say that we talked a little bit before we hit record here. So those numbers get pretty big, right? I think back to when my folks bought the house that I grew up in back in 1978, they paid $55,000 for it. Today, fast forward 40, 45 years, and cars are costing that much, and not even the super luxury cars. And to think about projecting that forward, hey, what does a new house cost today? And are our kids, my kids when they're my age, going to be buying $200,000 cars, right? It's just like blows your mind. And at the same time, that I think that there is some reality to that. So I have those conversations with folks.
Yeah, so I'd like to, unpack a couple of things that we've talked about here, that you talked about. I find your approach really interesting. Okay, so the first thing I would say that I like about your approach is that if you're going to adjust for inflation, you want to use the actual inflation, which I think historically is about 2.9%. But then you need to look up your investment returns. Okay. So when you're looking up your investment returns, they're generally a lot higher than people are willing to stomach actually putting on the portfolio. So just to give you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most portfolios earn at least 8%, even if they're like 50-50 bonds and stocks. So the number that you're putting in there, wow, that might make you feel uncomfortable if you actually use the numbers that are historically accurate. And same with the number. If you're going to use the inflation number, you got to use the returns number.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And we had this discussion with our colleague where the software was suggesting historical inflation, but then using returns that were like a third or more less than what historical averages are. And you go, well, listen, we assume super high inflation, or not high, regular inflation and really low returns compared based on history. Well, that's not telling the fair story. And I think you're exactly right that something like a 50-50 stock bond portfolio, 60-40. I mean, I know that when we run our software, we're looking at something around 9%.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that the right number?
A lot of people are uncomfortable if I put 9% in there. They think that sounds too good to be true. And I'm like, oh, okay.
And maybe they're right, Bridget. Like I don't argue, like I get that, but we have to use similar context. We can't use one side versus the other, because the risk of that, right? There's one risk if we're not being conservative enough, is that you run out of money. That's not a good thing, right? But the other risk is if we're super conservative and like kind of trimming it on both ends sort of thing, we're going to end up dying with a big mattress full of money. And that is not most people's goal, is to conserve and to cut down their enjoyment now to have a giant pot of money when I'm 90 years old, right? It's a slightly less damaging risk, but I think it's a real risk is over saving by being too conservative with our thought process.
Yeah, and that dying with a big dying maybe on a big mattress stuffed full of money, it doesn't sound that comfortable either. I've just been shopping for mattresses. So,
hey, Bridget, I got one thing. I know that you take a little bit of a different approach, or at least have in the past, on not really factoring inflation in to retirement projections. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about why it is real. I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. And there are some reasons why that makes sense, right? Or why that could be a good approach.
I've taken the approach that I learned from Burt Whitehead, so I'm going to quote my source. And what his experience, he was an innovator, a pioneer in the field, and started in the 70s with financial planning. So he started during stagflation, right? And so his approach was inflation is overrated. The motivator for using inflation and especially that formula that we were just talking about, we'll use inflation, but then we'll deflate returns, was created by people who make money off of having your money under their umbrella. And because they are motivated for you to oversave. They're motivated for you to die with a lot more money than you need to. So I don't know for sure that I don't think that's everybody's conscious motivation, but I think that that's something that's worth consideration. So when the other factor I think that is underrated is that how you actually spend in retirement. So let's break that down a little bit. First of all, Social Security is indexed for inflation, not exactly, but quite a bit. So that means that a major part of people's income that they use for spending when they're in retirement is already going to go up if there is inflation. A lot of people's pensions, it depends on the pension, if it's going to be indexed for inflation or not. Okay, so there's those two factors. So and then there's most people, if you got a paid off house, I'm not a huge proponent of a paid off house, but if you got a paid off house, or if you got a house with a mortgage, that's inflation protection. You are locked in. Your payment is locked in. Sure, property tax can increase, but if you've paid off your house, your payment is zero. That's locked in. Same with if you have a mortgage, your payment is locked in. And the only thing that can happen to it generally is it goes down if you've got a fixed mortgage, if you refinance. So these are the major things that major source of income and a major source of spending are locked in already when you're retired. So those are factors that people don't say. And I have another one too, but I figured you want to make some comments on this one.
I just, you're thinking, I think that's a really interesting point, right? As you think about those things, for some folks, 25 or 50% of their retirement cash flow comes from Social Security or pensions. And it's, Social Security for sure indexed for inflation. One thing you've brought up, as we've talked in previous episodes on various things, is buying a TV when you first were back and living, your own apartment, right? And if I remember right, something like $500, and probably for, a giant 24-inch TV or 27-inch TV back in those days. And some things, look at the prices of things like televisions, right, that have gone down over time. I sort of benchmark to things like, hey, the price of a new car. I mentioned that earlier. That assumes, is that going to continue in the future? That price of new cars continues to go up? Maybe, maybe not. But you look at things like electronics, and there's other things where you go, they've gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper over time. So how does that impact, our retirement projections? As some things certainly go down, and then there's other things that come in, like, back in 1995, there wasn't a great big technology bill for our cell phones and our services and those things, right? So some things like the cost of televisions goes way down, other things come into play. And for me, that just reminds me that it's so individualized to our situations, and we don't know what that is. We've got a client who is generally speaking, I think people drive less in retirement than when they're working. We've got a client that drives way more because of some of the hobbies that he has, right? It's just, so how can you apply those sort of things? It is individualized, and the future might not always be what the past was. That's an important factor to keep in mind, I think.
Well, one thing I just want to bring up to people when we talk about cars, I went to a continuing education, and the person who's now the head of the energy department was speaking, and she said that the predictions were that car prices and the cost of driving would come down dramatically with electric cars, and that would happen by 2030. Now, I don't know if that's true, but it seemed less likely when I saw her speak a couple of years ago than it does today, because the demand for electric cars is so great. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think we're getting, you brought up a point that I think dovetails with one of Burt Whitehead's points, is that when you're in retirement, you've got a lot more flexibility to do things if you've got the money or not. So for instance, do I redo my bathroom? Well, if I've got some money, yeah. If I don't have any money, no. Do I go to earlier dinner at the same place or a later dinner? Those kinds of things. You've got more flexibility to actually control your spending when you're in retirement than beforehand.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a great place to sort of wrap up. And I really appreciate you talking about that flexibility, because that is a big factor. And so what's the takeaway from things as I hear our conversation here with it, is that, is inflation going to be a factor in retirement? Probably there's some factor, right? There's a case to be made for that. There's also a case to be made that, it's not nearly what top line CPI or the consumer price index is, and probably not as scary for a retiree as it might be made out to be, and to really individualize, look at your situation and where things are, and not take a hardline stance on, hey, let's be, inflation's going to, I'm going to be spending more and more money until I'm 100 years old, sort of thing. And also maybe not to be quite so conservative and say, hey, it's not a factor at all, but to be thoughtful about how you put together your thinking with retirement. That's kind of my takeaway. I don't know if you have any final thoughts on it, Bridget.
Yeah, for me, one of the reasons that what I do is use no inflation, but then lower my investment returns to something that people are more comfortable with, is because I want to communicate. So I feel like when we use inflation adjusted numbers, it starts getting so big that people's minds are just blown and they give up.
And $200,000 car, right?
Yeah. And so again, it's all part of like, what am I comfortable with, and really being conscious of it rather than just being driven by fear. Yeah. So with that, I'm Bridget Sullivan Mermel, and I've got a fee-only financial planning practice in Chicago, Illinois.
And I'm John Scherer. I have a fee-only financial planning practice in Middleton, Wisconsin. Both Bridget and my firms are taking on new clients. So if you're interested, we'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to find an advisor that's in your local area, we're both members of the Alliance of Comprehensive Planners. And you can find more people that think like Bridget and I do by visiting acplanners.org.
And don't forget to subscribe.
I was waiting for that. Thanks.